Hello, everyone. Good night, everyone, or I should say good evening. My name is Camila Forbes. I am the executive producer of the Apollo Theater. And thank you for joining us for Ideas in Action with Ta-Nehisi Coates and Heather McGhee. The Apollo is partnering with One World to make virtual space for a conversation between two of our most thoughtful writers. Ta-Nehisi is is our current artist in residence at the Apollo, and Heather McGhee is a distinguished senior fellow with Demos. The Apollo is a commissioner, a presenter, a catalyst for new artists, ideas, and creative workforce space. Due to the COVID virus right now, we are currently closed, but we are creating events and opportunities that enable our community to come together in this time. So it's extremely exciting, and we're extremely honored to partner with One World on this particular moment in time. We partnered with One World before on several in-person events with Ta-Nehisi, one being with Ta-Nehisi Coates and Nicole Hannah-Jones that happened a couple years back. But tonight, Heather and Ta-Nehisi will be in conversation with One World Editor-in-Chief Chris Jackson about their work, but more importantly about this moment in our society. How have we gotten to this moment, what it means, and how might we start to think about the world we'll make on the other side of it? They'll also speak to the impact of this crisis on our cultural community more broadly. So I'm really thrilled to bear witness to these incredible thinkers and what they have to share as we all try to navigate our own way through this very unprecedented time. So without further ado, it's really my pleasure to introduce One World's editor-in-chief, Mr. Chris Jackson.
Hey there, thank you so much, Camilla, for that introduction.
Absolutely.
It's really great to be here. I thought here in my apartment, but also with all of you. I thought it might be good for us to start with a quick moment of silence, just to acknowledge the people who are suffering right now, the people who've lost jobs, those of us who we've lost altogether in this crisis, and the people who are on the front lines addressing it, whether they're doing it at a grocery store or at a hospital tonight. So just a quick moment of silence, I think, just in respect for those. All right, so it's really thrilling to be here. I just want to say a quick word of thanks to our partners at the Apollo Theater and to everyone at Penguin Random House and at One World Publishers who helped put this together. I'm Chris, as was already announced. I'm the editor-in-chief of One World and publisher, and I get to work with people like Ta-Nehisi and Heather and many others, from Brian Stevenson to Carla Villavicencio, on their work. It's the best job in the world, even if I have to do it from my home with a distance learning 11-year-old not far away. But it's a wonderful thing, and I'm really happy that tonight that we'll be able to talk to Ta-Nehisi and Heather, who Camilla's already introduced, but let me just do a quick recap of who these amazing people are. First of all, Ta-Nehisi Coates is the author of 4 books, The Beautiful Struggle, We Were 8 Years in Power, and Between the World and Me. His latest book is The Water Dancer, which was his first novel and a #1 bestseller, and I've been lucky enough to work with Ta-Nehisi on all 4 of those books. So let's introduce Ta-Nehisi Coates. And with us tonight in conversation is Heather McGhee, who is the former president of the inequality-focused think tank Demos. She's drafted legislation, she's testified before Congress, and she's been a regular contributor on many news shows. You've probably seen her many times. Today was the launch day of her TED Talk, which I encourage you all to see. We're going to talk a little bit about that at the outset. She's now a distinguished fellow, senior fellow, excuse me, at Demos. And I'd like to introduce her, Heather McGhee. So, thank you guys for being here with me.
It's so good to be with you, Chris.
Thank you. Ta-Nehisi doesn't care, it's fine.
Why are we starting like that?
I'm
you
sorry.
started out all solemn and everything, and now you're going to jokes already, right? This is what we're doing?
I'm sorry. Okay. So I thought we'd talk, like I just mentioned, this today was the launch of Heather's really powerful TED Talk about race and inequality. And I hope we talk about a lot of different things tonight, but we're definitely going to, I think, probably touch on the subject race. And it's funny because, I think in times like this, in times of great national, global crisis, there's certain people who feel like, well, now's the time not to talk about race. Now's the time to focus on other things. And we saw an article by Andrew Sullivan just the other day, who was kind of complaining about people sort of racializing what's going on right now. But I think it's probably going to intersect with a lot of what we have to talk about. So Heather, can you maybe tell us a little bit about the talk that was released today? Namely, you touch on a number of things, from Montgomery to the 2008 financial crisis to issues of wage stagnation. Can you just give us a little quick summations? I think everyone should watch the full talk, and then of course read the book when it comes out next year, of what your argument is.
Sure. Well, thank you. I just want to say to everyone who's joining, thank you for taking the time out of your night. Thank you to the Apollo Theater and to our publisher, One World, and to you, Chris. This is a somber moment. I mean, it's just a tragedy, what is going on in our neighborhoods and our communities to our people as Black people. And the idea that we should not be talking about the urgency of the crisis of inequality that this is laid bare is absurd. Because as I experienced in my nearly 20 years of working to address economic inequality and political inequality, you can't ignore racism. Because racism is the fuel that feeds inequality. And in so doing, it creates a fire that catches and burns and touches every house. And we are feeling that right now very acutely. My TED Talk this afternoon that went live on TED.com is called Racism Has a Cost for Everyone. And it is a talk about the main ideas in the book that will be out early next year, called The Sum of Us, What Racism Costs Everyone and How We Can Prosper Together. And I tell a number of stories about the realization that I had that racism leads to bad policymaking. It distorts decision-making. It makes for a worse economy, a harsher society, a more punitive one. It hollows out everything that we have in common. And the central parable of the book and of the talk is the story that happened in Montgomery, Alabama. That's the one that I talk about because I went and visited, but it happened in literally hundreds of towns all across the country, and not in the South, not just in the South, where cities and towns responded to desegregation orders in the 1950s and early 60s and decided to drain their public swimming pools or to close their public schools and park systems rather than share that public with Black families and brown families. And in many ways, I think that's what's happening to our country right now. And that's what's been happening to our country since the mid-1960s, which of course was the last time that a majority of white voters voted for a Democrat for president. You've got to confront the fact that we have not yet figured out how to be a multiracial America and be a generous one. And the generosity pretty much stopped when it had to be shared with people of color. And so I think we're all facing the costs of that. And I think that those costs are not just contained, it's impossible to contain them to the target communities. We'll always feel them the worst, but we will never be alone in the suffering from a society that is fundamentally ill. And that's where we are today, even before COVID came and struck.
Right, I think that's really interesting because I think, when the crisis first started with COVID, I think a lot of people saw this as an opportunity for us to see the ways in which we're all connected, right? To see that we're all because, it could happen to anyone. It's a virus. It's almost like a natural disaster that could not possibly discriminate, which is, I think, similar to what people thought maybe when Hurricane Katrina was coming into New Orleans. It's a natural disaster, but nature doesn't discriminate. And yet we see the ways in which nature landed in this case and in that case and many other cases on a system that was already in existence. And one of the reasons I thought the two of you would be an interesting pairing for this conversation is because I was thinking about Ta-Nehisi's piece that he wrote after the election of Donald Trump, called The First White President. And I just want to read just a short portion of it because I was rereading it today and it was just striking me all over again. Like, you know, I don't think of Ta-Nehisi as necessarily a writer who tries to be prophetic in any way, but there is a real prescience to what he wrote about the election of Donald Trump. He described well, first he says, it's utterly impossible to conjure a black facsimile of Donald Trump, to imagine Obama, say, implicating an opponent's father in the assassination of an American president, or comparing his physical endowment with that of another candidate and successfully capturing the presidency. Trump, more than any other politician, understood the balance of the bloody heirloom of white supremacy and the great power of it in not being a nigger. But the power is ultimately suicidal. And then he writes, it has long been an axiom among certain black writers and thinkers that whiteness endangers the bodies of black people in the immediate sense, but the larger threat was to white people themselves, the shared country, and even the whole world. There's an impulse to blanch at this sort of grandiosity. When Du Bois claims that slavery was singularly disastrous for modern civilization, or Baldwin claims that whites have brought humanity to the edge of oblivion because they think they are white, the instinct is to claim exaggeration, but there really is no other way to read the presidency of Donald Trump. The first white president in American history is also the most dangerous president, and made more dangerous still by the fact that those charged with analyzing him cannot name his essential nature because they too are implicated in it. And you go on to say that the world has handed over, the most powerful country in the world has handed over all of its affairs, the prosperity of its economy, security of its citizens, the purity of its water, the viability of its air, the safety of its food, the future of its vast system of education, the soundness of its national highways, airways, railways, the apocalyptic potential of its nuclear arsenal, to a carnival barker. And I think in some ways we're kind of seeing some of the effects of that.
Yeah, I mean, yeah, I agree. I agree with what I wrote. Yeah, you know, I think, well, I just want to back up to the point you just, you know, made. First of all, it's nice to be here with all of you guys. Nice to be here with Heather. And despite our banter, nice to be here with my editor and publisher. But Chris, you know, you asked this question about, you made this point about certain folks, writers, intellectuals, what have you, who would like us to stop talking about race. And I would submit that it is not us who began this conversation. When people frame it that way, they make it seem like you are taking the initial action. You are the one that is introducing factors and ideas that would not be there if you would just, you know, hush up about them. But, you know, what I would submit is, you know, when we see a COVID outbreak, Rikers Island, that is this society talking about race. When we see hotspots, coronavirus hotspots in Cook County Jail, that is this country talking about race. When we see, as you pointed out earlier, the coronavirus seemingly magically landing with disparate impact in places where Black and brown people live, that is this country talking about race. What people really want is they don't want us to reply to that. They don't want us to answer back. They don't want us to have a response, but they're having a conversation. They're having a conversation with the language of power. And the language of power tends to leave bodies around. And it is historically not like the response. So I think it's really, really important to be clear about it. And then not just having the conversation in that language of power and bodies. I mean, you got a president who wanted to call this the Wuhan virus, Chinese flu, or whatever it was, and threatened to actually hold up an international agreement unless racist language could be put into the agreement. And so I think it's really, really important to be very, very clear about who has started this conversation and where we stand within it.
Right. Well, Heather, it's interesting because, you know, I think in your work, one of the things I think is so kind of bracing about it is that you do acknowledge the ways in which, you know, all these phenomena fall most heavily, of course, on people who are poor, people who are Black, but you do also trace the lines that, you know, begin in the suffering of Black communities to the larger society. Like, you know, you talked about this in the case of the 2008 housing crisis, and how do you think that kind of factors into like the situation we're seeing right now?
You know, that metaphor of the pool, it's about really all being in, and a question of are white Americans willing to be in the same pool with us, right? And that is actually a term that's used very often in healthcare, where whether you're talking about an insurance pool, right? You want the largest number of people in the pool so that no single person's risk, ends up, costing too much. Or when you think of things like vaccines or public health interventions, you actually want the largest possible number of people, and you are only as safe as the most vulnerable. So when you look at, for example, what we did on healthcare in 2009 with the Affordable Care Act, 20 million more people have healthcare than they did. I mean, just a tremendous victory that the first African American president accomplished 100 years almost after it was first attempted. And yet all the ways that it really would have been about everyone getting in the pool together, whether it was the government negotiating drug prices, or of course, any kind of public option or expanding Medicare, that is where the white majority was wholly resistant, and still continues to be resistant to the very idea of expanding Medicaid to working class people of all races all across the former Confederacy. If you look at the maps of the places that have refused to follow John Roberts' logic when he said it's okay for states to refuse to expand Medicaid as part of this law, he claimed states' rights again. And look who responded and said, no, we won't share across lines of color. And there's research that shows that the more Black people who live in a state, the more likely it is that the white people who live in that state are to oppose the expansion of Medicaid. And so healthcare really is about being connected. And so this is absolutely where you see the inability of white America to shed the belief in a hierarchy of human value come back to make us all vulnerable. Because kid not, we are still all vulnerable. It is true that on Navajo Navajo reservations in Indian country right now, there are incredibly rampant over incidences of COVID, and that the biggest hotspot in the country is Cook County, not far from where I grew up. But it is also true that you have tens of thousands of white Americans falling ill, losing their jobs, 5.5 million people going on unemployment, businesses that'll never recover. So like the financial crisis, which started out as predatory loans to credit-worthy Black homeowners who were already homeowners. This is a stereotype I try every time I can to refute for people, the idea that it was Black and brown folks getting into houses they couldn't afford and should never have been in. That poison started out being tested out in our communities. And then once the greed machine took hold of it, it spread out to the wider, whiter mortgage market. And I think that's what you're seeing today.
Yeah, no, I thought you had a great line in your talk where you said that, it wasn't the people, it was the loans. The loans were the problem, and by trying to say it was isolated somehow in some stereotype of like who those people were who were receiving the loans, you missed the actual issue, which is one of those sort of frightening things, I think, when, even with what's happening with the virus, when people start to try to name it according to different communities, because you can kind of see how that process has worked historically. Like if you can say crack is a problem for Black communities, then you'll see the response be a certain kind of response, whereas if you say opioids are a problem in general, in the heartland, you see a different kind of response. And it's a scary thing. And that kind of just brings me to another question, which is about like how we kind of shift the conversation. And Ta-Nehisi, I know you and I have talked a lot about the idea of how we change narratives around the conversation around race and equality and belonging and identity, and how important that is to as a part of the process of changing the larger systems. And you, I know right now, are working on fiction right now. What, in a moment like this, do you feel like this is at all like becoming, and of course your last book was a novel. Do you feel like there is a responsibility or a role you have as someone who's creating fictional worlds to kind of try to respond, to lead, to imagine us into different futures, or help us think about our past in a different way?
Yeah, I think we have a very limited view of politics a lot of times in our conversations. And I think we have a almost ballot-centric view of politics, which is to say politics that really centers around the act of voting. Now, the act of voting is very, very important. So it's not that it's not important or that it should not be done. It's not that this year it isn't, consequential. But it's like brushing your teeth or taking out your trash. You got to do it. It's a duty. But that's not the end of your duties, and that's not the end of what one would call good hygiene, if I can torture the metaphor. And so I think a lot of times we don't really think about how we got to the point, or how we get to a certain place in a ballot box situation where we are not necessarily all that enthused about who we have to vote for in the first place. And I think a lot of that is all of the politics that happens beforehand. The example I think of, right now that I think is playing out. Well, let me just start with a pretty, flat out statement. We don't in this country regard Black people as human beings, okay? We just don't. I mean, we don't, and you can see it in how the conversation is taking place right now around coronavirus, okay? I have heard countless numbers of people say, sometimes Black, in fact, very often Black, that part of, if not the whole reason why this is hitting us the hardest is because of our habits. We are not social distancing. We don't eat the right foods. We are doing all of these little individual things. It has been fascinating to me to hear this and to watch this at the very moment that I see white people storming the state capitol in Michigan in defiance of a public health ordinance. There is a way that we feel, or when I see pictures, for instance, right here in New York City, of white people at the farmers markets or out in Prospect Park. Now, people express, rage and they're upset with that. That's not what I'm saying. But when you have people literally dying, in the Black community, those who have the least, and the expression that it is somehow their fault, that's a piece of a very, very old dialogue and an old way of thinking about Black people, wherein you make systemic white failure, as I was saying in an Instagram post, into somehow individual Black failure. The very fact that you only speak about Black people or only speak about other people who are not white in that particular way, I think, again, it's a conversation about who you regard as human and who you don't. Now, where do we get those ideas from? And I would argue that, again, in the politics that happens before you even get into a ballot box, before you even get to a policy, there is a conversation that has historically been happening and continues to happen in the art and in the culture of this country. Gone with the Wind is a work of great politics and a work of great political import. Birth of a Nation led to the rebirth of the Ku Klux Klan. These ideas about who is human and who is not have been repeatedly drummed into folks' head. And so you end up in a situation where you think you're in an intellectual debate or intellectual conversation, but because the culture has already asserted to you over and over again that you are less than, that you are not human, the conversation is already skewed. You can't have a conversation on logic and facts when somebody already regards somebody else as human. And so to the extent that, obviously I like writing fiction, I enjoy it very much, but also, view it as a logical extension of my politics. And that is to, render Black people as human beings, render their history, their culture, their struggle as, equal, as humans, and as worthy of the same, respect and belonging on the same level of conversation, so that we don't have situations where people are quite literally, falling down and dying in the streets, and we're having, some conversation about pop and Big Mama.
Yeah, yeah. Heather, you've also talked a lot about how we can kind of see our way through this, and how it is a complex thing. It's not simple enough to have like policy solutions if you don't, in some ways, there's almost like a spiritual or cultural kind of dimension to, I think, the work that we have to do as a country.
Yeah, I am. So for almost 20 years, I was working in public policy, in trying to rewrite the laws, and successfully, in many cases, rewriting the laws around our democracy and our economy, whether it was financial reform, credit card debt, bankruptcy, voting rights laws, campaign finance laws, because in my heart, I'm a wonk. I want to change the rules that dole out power in our society and put more of them in the favor of more people. And yet, and I became the president of a think tank when I was 33 years old, right? And it was, in many ways, like the biggest, best job I could have in that world. And after about half a decade there, at Demos, at the helm, I kept running up against, and in many ways, the depositing of a carnival barker into the White House was the last straw on this. But I kept running up against the fact that we are not healed, and that we can continue to write different laws, but laws at their core are just expressions of beliefs. And when you change the laws to say that we can sit by side and learn side by side and drink from the same fountains and enter the same doors, if you haven't changed the esteem with which the white majority holds us, you will find mountains being moved in order to continue that separation. And that's what we have, right? We are as segregated in our school system as we were before Brown. We have an entire new category of private schools that did not exist before Brown. We have private everything that did not exist before integration. And so I'm a deep believer in the power of the dream, and the power of the dreamers, and the power of fiction, and in fact, speculative fiction. My mother, who taught me everything I know, she saw Black Panther in the theater like 4 or 5 times. And she came out and she said, well, now I know how white people feel, because I spent just 2.5 hours seeing myself and us as the heroes, and I think I can conquer the world. And I grew up as a science fiction and fantasy nerd, and the first time I sat there in the scene, when Shruki is like, being the one to save the day, the nerdy Black girl is the one to like put the action in place that saves the day. Tears were rolling down my face in the darkness, because I just realized how much all of my imaginative life, with just a few exceptions, I had to project into a white male body as hero in order to end the story. So I think it's extremely important. And I also think that politics matter. And I think the storytelling, I think we have so much that we can learn about this moment, particularly because someone who is a worker of fiction, which is Donald Trump, right? The fiction of his own wealth, the fiction of his piousness, the fiction of his intelligence, the fiction of his business acumen. He is a reality star, a marketer, someone who slaps his name on things. He knows about the dreamers and the dream. That's actually, that sort of cotton candy economy is what he has always actually trafficked in. And so we have to recognize that politics is also about storytelling. It's about dreaming. It's about projection of who we want to be. And the most powerful force in our politics has always been, and still is, this question of who we think we are and who we project that sense of identity onto in terms of our political leaders. So, I'm not going to say anything right now about the presidential race that we are with at this moment, but I do believe that there is so much room for. There's so many spaces in between politics, policy, and culture that we have to occupy them all if we're going to make change.
Yeah, I just want to if I could just if I had the emojis, I would do the applause with the black hands and everything. But no, I just think that's so on point, man. Yeah, exactly. I think that's so on point. And Chris, like I had a very, very similar moment, man. I mean, like I would, when I was at the Atlantic, I had great editors and I had great fact checkers. And so if I was going to write something about, reparations at the Atlantic, you know what I mean? Like I was going to make a case for reparations or any number of things at the Atlantic. Everything had to be right to a T. They put 5, as they should. I'm not saying I resent it. They put 5 fact checkers on the story. Everything has to be right, and you know it, and you get it down, and you can document it to people. And they just, you know what I mean? They don't want to hear it. I mean, to probably even bigger than that was like when I, and this still has had, impact on me to this day, was doing the research around the Civil War. And you could literally show people the documents wherein Southern government said, this is why we are going to war. Or you go so far as to say, like, you could show them letters, because this exists, of people saying, there are people who are saying we are only going to war for states' rights. No, we are going to war for slavery, and the record needs to be clear. And they don't want to hear it. So that's not a logical argument. You're not going to change policy. I mean, and again, I want to be really, really clear about this. I'm not denigrating policy. I'm putting it within the context of other things. I'm saying that it doesn't exist in this place alone, uninfluenced by other ideas. If I think you're a dog, the laws of humanity do not matter. They have no reference or any sort of anything. If I think you're a dog, if I think you are a Kenyan Muslim in America, not there's anything wrong with being a Kenyan Muslim in America, but if I think you're a Kenyan Muslim to the point that I don't think you're a legitimate president, you can pull out your birth certificate, your long form, your short form. You can do whatever you want. It doesn't matter. And we see that because the guy who said it is now president.
Right.
It doesn't matter. People, believe. And so, the flip side of that, of what Heather was just saying, which was so powerful about Black Panther, that I have to say. I mean, this is the thing, I've said this before. The thing that gives me the most hope and the most optimism is actually the arts and culture, because there are 6, 7, 8-year-old white boys and girls who are also seeing Black Panther. And their vision of what humanity is consequently and will be consequently different. It's not enough in and of itself. That's not what I'm saying. But it's very, very powerful. We know how it worked on us to see, heroes and have to, see ourselves, through white eyes. We know what that did to us. And this is the first time perhaps in American history where it's actually being thrown back in a really righteous way. You have to be, hopeful about that.
Yeah, so it's interesting. I was having a conversation earlier today with our executive editor, Elizabeth Mendez-Berry, and we were talking about this idea about changing the narrative and what that really means. And she was saying how, there's this idea that changing the narrative is changing a story, but really to change the narrative means to change stories, to change politics, to change points of, activism, places where we pressure governments and power. Changing the narrative is like this holistic thing that has to happen across the board. And when we're having this discussion right now here at the Apollo Theater. It's my first time being on stage at the Apollo. It's a special night for me. But the Apollo, like a lot of cultural institutions right now, is closed down and is imperiled in some ways. Like a lot of cultural institutions are by not being open. We see this in the biggest cultural institutions. We see like the Metropolitan Museum and Museum of Modern Art, things like that are starting to really feel the sting of what's going on now. And I'm wondering, because culture is so important to what we're doing, I wonder what in this moment, what culture do you feel like is nourishing you? And don't say Tiger King. what culture in this moment?
You go first. Ta-Nehisi.
Oh, if anybody can see what's back here, it's a bunch of hardbound comic books and Dungeons and Dragons, and Black Panther up there, and there's a Captain America hat. It's funny because it's weird, man. I mean, we're never in charge of who where we get ideas from. You know, part of being Black, and I guess part of being any sort of, you know, marginalized culture, be you Black, LGBT, women, whatever, anybody who's, you know, had to look at society from the outside, is, even if you are looking at a world that was not built on the rules and the idea that you yourself are human, you find yourself taking lessons from that anyway. And so, you know, I've, you know, as a child and even to this very day, have come to hold the world of comics, you know, very, very important and very, very close to me. It was the first place where I actually saw, you know, a Black woman who was a hero in Storm and the X-Men. I was like 9 years old, you know, and I'm actually writing, you know, her in little bits, you know, in Black Panther right now. And so the comics industry, man, I mean, I enjoy it, you know. About 3 people read it, but, you know, that's also beautiful too. You know, I was telling somebody the other day, I feel like I got all my little toys and I'm just bashing them back and forth in my room. You know what I'm saying? My little action figures like a kid again, except everybody's Black. Well, not everybody, because I write Captain America too, right? And that's fun too. You know, being able to ask questions about gender, about identity. You know, to think about the president of the United States actually, you know, from different perspectives. So, you know, even if I'm not, I guess, writing in the most widely distributed places, you know, right now, I am writing, and I'm, you know, and I am drawing great sustenance, you know, from the reading and writing that I'm doing right now. That probably would be it. I do gotta say, you know, I know this is probably not on topic, that the comics industry is in a very, very bad place right now. And so I don't know if we have any fans among this 500 people in this room who are fans of the industry, but some of, you know, our greatest creators who made me, you know, possible in the first place, you know, are seeing their livelihoods endangered and imperiled, and we are feeling for them right now.
Okay. Heather?
So if you can see what's behind me in this library, which is actually my mother's library, but we have a big overlap. It's like, you know, race books, and that's what I'm reading, and it's not giving me it's not giving me any of that joy and lift and escape, because I'm still in the drafting and very much in the moment of just being fully in these ideas right now about race and inequality. About our story as Americans. I'm fully in nonfiction. I haven't read fiction in I don't know how long, and I'm suffering from it. But music right now. I also just mostly listen to people from before I was even born. I listen to a lot of Richie Havens right now. I listen to Curtis Mayfield. Obviously went back on a Bill Withers whole journey. You know, I listen to a lot of reggae. Yeah, I'm not watching much. Everyone's like, what are you streaming? I'm like, I have a toddler. I'm not streaming anything. He goes to bed at 9 o'clock and then I'm washing dishes and getting back to work. So yeah, sadly, no.
Yeah, it's funny. I was telling Ta-Nehisi a while ago that I was listening to a lot of gospel music now, which I don't normally listen to a lot of. And I'm not, I would say, a devout believer, to understate the matter a little bit. But it has been interesting thinking about the kind of music or the kind of culture that kind of feeds you in moments when you feel a little bit of despair out there. And it's interesting, like, how there's these 2 different poles. Like, I think one is, like Ta-Nehisi was saying, like, there's this kind of, and you're both like, which is interesting because you're both writers. And this doesn't surprise me, that the culture you both describe is the culture that immerses you further into your own work. Working with a lot of writers, I know that the answer is usually my work in some way, no matter what the question is. But it's interesting that there are these 2 poles. Like, part of it, I think what a lot of us want to do right now is focus on our imaginations, in the sense of trying to imagine our ways into different worlds, or into worlds that our own world could be, or use our imaginations to try to figure out like the dynamics of the world we live in today. And others of us, I think, are really about like trying to hyper-examine the world as it is right now. And they're not actually poles, they're kind of like sides of the same coin. And I think a lot of us go back and forth between them. But right now, are you thinking about where we go from here? Are you thinking about what's on the other side? I feel like probably we're very early in this, but have you been giving that any thought?
Well, I think we have to. I mean, this is a cracking open of much of what many people believed to be American greatness, right? The fact that we can't get some tests together, we can't get some masks together, we can't get some gloves together. The fact that 25 million people could go from jobs to no jobs like this. The fact that essential workers are now grocery store clerks and bus drivers. I mean, this is a world undone. And so it is absolutely, I believe, our responsibility to move into what has been created, that spaces that's been created in the cracking open, and move things permanently, like get down to the foundations. You are seeing a party that had no interest in spending our money on anything but tax kickbacks to the wealthy, saying here's $2 trillion. Now, granted, the Senate Republicans still made sure they put more little tax sweeteners into millionaires in that, but you're seeing Republicans supporting a guaranteed income. You're seeing bipartisan support for paid sick leave. We have bills for essential workers bill of rights that is not just nurses and doctors, but actually, gig workers and delivery drivers. You are seeing the level of support right now among the American public for a rent strike to be, over majority, the highest ever support for Medicare for all, as 5 million people woke up and suddenly didn't have health care because that job that they felt so secure in was gone. So people are realizing that having your job tied to your ability to see the doctor is maybe not a good idea. So we have no excuses not to be not only dreaming of another world, but fighting for another world, articulating it and saying, you know what, the neoliberal consensus that privatized and individuated and atomized everything to the point that we can't do anything together, even protect ourselves, has fallen apart. Margaret Thatcher said, there's no such thing as society. Well, right now there absolutely is. We are only as secure as this society is. And so I think this is absolutely, there's absolutely the possibility of a brand new day. And you are seeing tectonic shifts in public opinion and a desperation, because I think for if we fight like heck, there will be a changing of the guard in Washington, and there will be a new administration that for the second time in 12 years is inheriting, the brink of a Great Depression, if not that. And so the question is, are we talking about guaranteed income? Are we talking about a National Jobs Act? Are we talking about just fully changing the social contract, but this time to include everybody and not exclude anybody based on a false belief in a hierarchy of human value? I think that's what's on the table. I absolutely think that the time for reparations in all its form is absolutely going to be now. I don't see what more calamitous thing could be delivered to this country. How much more we need to be sent back into our rooms and think about what we've done in this moment.
What'd you say?
Aliens, an alien invasion.
An alien invasion.
An alien invasion. All right, you make that happen.
Ronald Reagan was always talking about the alien invasion that was going to bring us together. Ta-Nehisi, I just have one more question. Then we have a few questions from the audience that I'd like to get to, because there's a lot of them, and we're not going to be able to get to all of them. But so it's interesting what Heather was saying, because I think, and I mentioned maybe this to you before, that I think there's a lot, like I feel a lot of the same ways. But I do wonder how much we there's other people who feel like their own ideas about how American society should be organized have been affirmed by what's happening right now, but from the polar opposite end of the political spectrum. So do you think, and this is a tricky question, but has there been anything that has happened over the course of this crisis that has surprised you, like not affirmed the thing you already believed, but actually made you think about something in a new way?
Surprised me? Probably so. I'm having trouble thinking of it because you kind of put me on the spot. That doesn't mean, like if I thought about it, I wouldn't. I guess what I want to say is I really hope Heather's right. And I don't mean that in a sarcastic, yeah, okay, like sort of hope she's right. So that, like, I literally hope Heather's right. But I think whiteness is a very powerful idea. I think roughly 35 to 40% of this country, at the very least, the best you can say it of, is they do not think being a bigot, being a racist, being a sexist, they don't think that's a disqualifying feature for being leader of the free world. So you start there. That would be hard. That would be hard no matter what. Well, then you look at the opposition party. And this is basically the fundamental operating position of the opposition party. If you want to have any sort of power in the Republican Party today, you have to be a Trumpist, period. There's no, a small c. The Conservative Party is actually the Democratic Party. And I mean that in the sense that the party that is actually fighting for status quo America. As Joe Biden said, go back to what we were before that. That's actually the Democratic Party. The Republican Party is a reactionary party, a destructive party, a party that seeks to literally destroy the institutions of America. That's what happened. That is what the past 4 years have been about. They've been an assault on American government and institutions. So you have an opposition party that is in itself Trumpist. The party as a basic plank says being a bigot, being a racist, being a sexist is not a disqualifying feature for being leader of the free world. Now that's very dangerous. It's very, very dangerous because what that means is when you say being a white male is a force for elevation within the party, you end up with people who tend not to be the best qualified and most intelligent, and most well-trained folks to do the job. So you have somebody like, I'm blanking on it, Kelly Conway, earlier, a couple days earlier, not really knowing what COVID-19 means, and yet speaking to Americans about this is very, very dangerous. And then on top of that, you have a country that is fundamentally lurching towards American apartheid. What do I mean by that? I mean, while I salute the victory in Wisconsin, I really do. I think it's absolutely incredible. People fighting their asses off, but folks literally had to risk their lives in order to vote. Mm-hmm. And that is a preview of what you should expect in November. And so you have a voter ID law that I believe just passed in Kentucky. You have the forces of America. You have bone deep stuff like the Senate itself, the Electoral College itself. It could be that Donald Trump could lose a majority again and still. Sorry, I muted myself. I must be going on. Still managed to prevail. That's me telling me to shut up. The point I'm trying to make is it would not at all shock me if that minority, that energetic minority, that critical mass that holds whiteness close through undemocratic means that are enshrined in law and in our Constitution, manage to hold on to power. I hope that's not true. I hope that we do value competence. I hope we do value having tests and having the mask and having ventilators. I hope we do. I really, really hope we value that more than we value white macho. but it's not yet clear to me that the country as constructed right now does.
Yeah, it's interesting. I do think that I feel very much, and I've been talking to like a lot of our writers who are kind of grappling with this in various ways. There is a sense that, you know, we are at a crossroads, and we've been at crossroads before. Even in our lifetime, we've seen like 9/11 and other moments that seemed like everything will change in this moment. And we saw, like in 9/11, everything did change in a way. We've had 20 years of war, increasing inequality, and surveillance, and collapse of civil liberties, and rising of ethno-nationalism. And so we're at another crossroads. And I think, Heather, I think you make an excellent point. Like, we're at a crossroads, and this is the moment where we have to fight to make sure that we go down a better road, and not just sort of let ourselves drift back into, because other people are organized, other people are ready to fight. And I think we have to be too. Okay, I'm gonna turn to a question from the audience. I don't have the name of the questioner, I'm sorry. But, well, this is an interesting question. At the recent protest in Michigan against the governor's public health orders, some people brought Confederate flags. How is the Civil War relevant in a northern United States capital in 2020, particularly around a protest around social isolation? Now, since both of you write about history in your books a lot, I'm sorry. I'm just gonna say, both of you, there's a lot of really interesting history in your work. So how is the Civil War relevant to a protest in 2020 in Michigan?
Of course they brought Confederate flags. It makes, I mean, it makes, anybody who thinks that that protest is some sort of principled objection to public health is wrong. I mean, the Confederate flag is the symbol of triumphant whiteness. That triumphalism. That's exactly, you know, what it is, and it should come as anybody who lives in, any Black person certainly that lives in Detroit or lives in Michigan or lives in Lansing knows, you know, full well that triumphalist whiteness is not, you know, does not end at the Mason-Dixon line. I mean, Detroit, you know, for instance, is a city where, you know, during the 1960s they literally firebombed Black people to keep them from moving, you know, out of you know, into better housing. And so, you know, that you would have folks who, I think we can go so far as to say, you know, a Trump aligned, or Trumpists, or Trumps themselves, would then fly the flag of white supremacy. It makes sense. It's appropriate. I salute them. They have the right flag.
So, Heather, it's interesting because you also, you do write a lot about history and the historical roots of this. Do you think that an event like this, I mean, is there ever a point where we can say, okay, this marks the end of a certain arc in our historical story, that maybe we can find a way to like start from a new page?
It's more like waves, you know, it really is. And also, we're so damn young. This country is so young. I mean, you know, we're just so young. I mean, I don't think anybody on this call is going to live to see the time when we can say, okay, the founding era is over, right? We're just really young as compared to so many societies with the ambitions of ours and the impact of ours on the world. So, no. I will just say about those Michigan protests, absolutely +1 to everything that Ta-Nehisi said, you know, of course, but also follow the money. Also note that it was a number of billionaire funded AstroTurf groups that organized that, right? To give Trump cover to reopen the economy, right? To get the stock market back, right? You always have to follow the money. You know, I say in my talk that I am more interested, just because I'm a systems person, in holding accountable the people who are selling racist ideas for their own profit than I am those who are desperate enough to buy those racist ideas. Everyone is guilty, but in terms of where we can really make change, is it going to be, you know, someone who drives his car up to the, you know, to the Capitol and honks his horn and waves a flag? Or is it going to be the billionaire who organized the whole damn thing and is actually the one who's got Trump on speed dial?
That's interesting. So I would say that was one of the more chilling photographs of this whole era, which has been full of chilling photographs of various kinds. Was, you know, those people planting their faces on the window of the State House in protest, because I think, again, it was a reminder that, you know, there are like forces that are organized and that are already trying to claim and direct, like, you know, the narrative around this, you know, so which is
And
what
they were breathing each other's air, faces this close.
it's crazy.
No, it's not
They
crazy.
will get
No,
sick.
It totally makes sense.
They will get sick.
It totally makes sense. It totally. I mean, and again, you know, just back to the Confederates. Like, the thing, whiteness is a suicidal, murder-suicidal idea. I am willing to take you down with me.
That's right.
You know, if I have to go. You know, I think, and this didn't even occur to me until I was, you know, thinking about listening to that. I had to talk a little bit. Like, if you take it back to the Civil War, you had big planners that owned, you know, 500,000 human beings who would happily inaugurate the war. And then you had people in that society who owned nothing, who were willing to go and die for it.
That's right.
Obviously, on some level, I feel a level of sympathy for those who have less power and have less ability. But I also don't want to take away from the fact that those billionaires are racist too. It's not, you know, like, I think they might be selling what they believe. I think they are selling what they believe. And I think it's really, you know, important to remember. I mean, it's a powerful idea, man. People do totally illogical things. You know, in the Civil War, you know, they told folks, preach to these young, you know, boys, these young white boys down south who own no slaves. Oh, you'll be able to drink all the blood that'll be spilled, you know, in a thimble. I mean, this is a thing that was actually said, and you can see the spirit of that now, when people are doing something that's actually going to wreak havoc. You know, wreaking havoc in Idaho, wreaking havoc in South Dakota right now.
Right.
You know, and I'll die for it.
Absolutely. Okay, I'm going to try to get another question in there. Okay, a simple but sincere question. How are you doing? So, you guys have not been at the State House breathing other people's air, I assume. So you all have been socially isolated for all this time. How is that for you? You both obviously have like lots of things to occupy you in this time. All of us, I think, are among the most lucky in this horrible situation. But what has it been like for you? That's a really complicated question, I know, but jump in, please.
It's a very kind question, a generous question. So I have a 19-month-old son and a small New York apartment, and a mother who lives alone, who's near 70 in Maryland. So before the city shut down, we live in Brooklyn, but we drove down here to Prince George's County, Maryland. And that's where we've been. I'm an extrovert. I love people. I love spontaneous meetings and gatherings. I love New York. I felt like I was abandoning the city. I still do. It feels wrong to not be there. And I'm like the psychic weight. I remember going to the grocery store before we left, and you know, I feel like I'm always talking about myself crying. I don't even cry that much, but like just in the aisles, people weren't freaked out yet. You know, it wasn't like a barren shelf type of situation, but I just felt the press of people's anxiety and of what was coming and how much we were going to lose and how many people we were going to lose. And it was suffocating and also completely grounding in the enormity of what this was going to be. And this was March 13th. So it's hard. It's not hard for me personally in terms of my money or my health. It is hard because I feel what is happening to us Black people, us New Yorkers, us us human beings, human fucking beings, excuse me, all over the world.
Yeah. Ta-Nehisi, how are you?
I'm
You
decent.
doing
I'm good. I mean, I don't, obviously I don't like it, you know what I mean? But I'm here, you know, I have, you know, my wife, who I love. I got a 19-year-old son who's home. You know, love having him here. We're having, you know, the kind of struggles that, you know, probably would have if you're forced to live in an apartment with your dad who's, you know, used to doing things his own way. But I think as a Black person, you know, living in what is now the worldwide epicenter, and Heather, you were right to go. You got to live. I don't think anybody should feel guilty at all. And you know, I mean that. But being here right now and being Black at the epicenter, I'm better than most. I think that's really, really important to remember. What I think about is, you know, I've been in New York, you know, almost 20 years now, and I was looking back and I realized that apparently a part of the New York experience is disaster. Either it's a blackout, it's 9/11, it's always something existential happening. And I'll just say, you know, and I think about this all the time, as somebody who has made a couple of jumps in income or wealth relatively quickly, I can remember having to weather other disasters and having very little resources. And I remember how much it sucked, how bad it was. And so I am thinking about people who, you know, may not, you know, have had the good luck that I had. I'm thinking about people even beyond that. You know, Chris, we talked about this. You know, I'm thinking about people who are managing mental illness. You know, I'm thinking about people who are in situations with abusive spouses. I'm thinking about, you know, people who are, you know, in situations with substance abuse. This is a massive, massive betrayal by the state of its citizenry. I understand that we should be wearing masks. I understand that you should be distancing 6 feet away. I'm doing all that. I understand you need to, you know, stay in the house. But I want to be very, very clear. We are left to fend for ourselves as individuals, and those of us who have more will be able to fend better. Those of us who have less will have, you know, a harder time. This is happening because of a massive, historic betrayal by the state. It fills me with just rage when I think about it, how people who have the most, who are appointed to protect this country, to protect its citizens, have left them, as the president said, you know, today, find your own way, go for yourself, to go. That's what it is. It's a go for Delph government right now. It is deeply, deeply infuriating. I'm okay. I'm not so sure about some of my other folk here in New York.
Yeah, this might be a good moment to bring up that we also, you know, wanted to talk about a couple of organizations that if people want to get involved and support in this, we encourage them to. Heather, I think you had a couple of organizations you wanted to point out. They're doing some work right now.
Yeah, the Brooklyn Community Foundation has a fund, a COVID fund that is, you know, Brooklyn Community Foundation has a very race-forward lens, and they are funding communities of color, not just in Brooklyn, but in New York, direct funds to people, to caregivers, to nonprofit organizations to hold them up. And then the National Bailout, which collects bail money to get Black mamas out and caregivers out of jail and get them home in a place. Those are the two I would shout out. So Brooklyn Community Foundation and National Bailout, both of which you can Google.
Great. And those of you who are in the Zoom, I think we have it also in a link that you guys can check out. All right. Well, you know, our hour is up, which is really too bad because I'd really love to keep talking to you guys more. But thank you so much for joining us here tonight. And just a reminder, please watch Heather's TED Talk, which is, Heather's over here for me, which is amazing. And you know, really as the beginning of her kind of articulating some of these themes that will be even further developed in her book, which will be out early next year. And of course, Ta-Nehisi's work hopefully you already know, but both his nonfiction and fiction, I think, is essential, both in the way it's kind of, it's certainly for me, it's been incredibly helpful to try to, as a lens to which to understand this particular moment. And in the fiction, I think it's both, sort of edifying in that same way and clarifying in that same way, but also allows you to immerse yourself in something other than this world, in a beautiful work of fiction. So anyway, thank you both so much. And to everyone out there, this is the first of our One World kind of speaker series, where we're going to have our authors coming and having conversations, so we can stay connected with our community of readers in this time when we're also isolated, and talk about the things that matter the most. So thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. Thank you to the Apollo Theater for providing a venue for us here in these boxes. And good night.
Good night. Thank you.
Thank you, guys.